Well, you're in the wrong part of the world to say I'm not an Alabama fan, though, right?
I'm from Alabama. I didn't go to Alabama.
Neither did I, but I like them. I went to Vanderbilt, so what am I gonna do? I mean, if you graduate from Vanderbilt, you're just smart. I mean.
I went to state, so.
Me too. So, okay, so
Okay.
we're getting started. We're still got a little bit of that first thing left, and then we'll be rocking and rolling on the next module or whatever you want to call it. So we're at 10 of the last things. So we talked about the resurrection of the body, I think, didn't we, or the those kind of things, and how and what it's like, ma'am.
We were down to hell.
We were down to hell. Okay, so yes, we talked about hell. So intermediate state or paradise, I covered that last time too, saying there are several ways that the Bible speaks of it, or St. Paul and speaks of it as a state where we're sort of in a sleep or unconscious state while we wait for the general resurrection, and then also there's an active state where we ascend the heavens. So those are two of the ways Paul talks about this intermediate state or paradise until it happens, and we talked about a little bit the history of purgatory and all that. So we should be done with that, right? And so then the resurrection of the body. This is where it gets this is one of the places where modern society and modern cultural practices sort of butt heads with the church. You'll often hear say at funerals, that's not Papa, she's not here, that's just a shell of somebody, or you'll have now in the age of cremation, you'll have people that are sort of cast people to the winds and put them in the ocean and then the golf course or the football or the Disney World, things like that. So, but what we understand about resurrection, or faith that the church teaches about the resurrection of the body, is that when Jesus returns, we will rise in a physical but glorified state. So our body has lasting value and importance. Does that make sense? Which goes kind of, like I said, that really goes against it. So even though we allow cremations, it's not the normal practice, but cremations, we have to treat the body, the cremains the exact same way we would treat a non-cremated body, right? So so we have to go through all the processes and all those things the same. And so I get in a lot of trouble, or people become disenchanted with me, if I can say that, that want me to go to the beach and, sprinkle the ashes here or there. And I'm like, I have to treat this like a non-cremated body, and so, but the arguments also sort of changed. Like when I was a kid, people were worried. Like I remember at the front end of cremation and things like that, they were worried more so like, oh, if they cremate, can I rise back? What happens when we rise from the dead? So there's arguments that people worried about. What happens to people that fall overboard on a ship and are eaten and by sharks and taken 5 different directions? And but now the question, like those kind of things, those anxieties and fears have sort of gone down, and people are like, well, if God's big enough to, he can collect me from the sea or whatever, and all this kind of stuff. So now they're, the argument shifted, but it's really not about what God can do in any of those cases. It's our faithful response to God, and our faithful response to the Christian hope, and a faithful response out of love. And so that is that the value, our physical bodies in some way, shape or form, have an eternal value and worth. And so we have to treat them as such. Does that make sense? So, but in this day and age, you'll see all kind of things. Like I've done a funeral up in North Mississippi, almost 2 decades now, where there was a new trend where I went to the visitation, and they had the deceased person in their favorite recliner with like a cooler of beer, watching a Mississippi State football game. And so there's like I said,
Serious?
yeah, oh yeah, it was like there's a trend now to like do all these different things, and so. But that's what the church teaches, that you have to treat the human body with respect, that it's eternal and lasting, made in the image of likeness of God, and has an eternal worth and value. So that's why the church takes such care of funerals and things like that. And you generally, for the most part, you won't see people doing things such as spreading ashes here or there, but you have to treat them as you would a non-cremated body. If they are spread, they're spread in a consecrated area, like in a garden or something like that. So again, that is not a statement of God's power, but a statement of our faithful response to the Christian hope and all of that. So any questions about that? And I kind of talked about everlasting life as well the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to end here. Are there any questions of the last things?
I think sometimes, especially evangelical, such a dualistic view of body and soul, we tend to think our soul or spirit's going to just be in heaven forever, but there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth.
That's right.
We're going to rise again in a new body.
And so you will see, so we would say that those have a value and a worth, but there's also sort of a Gnosticism now that's like physical stuff is bad, spiritual stuff is good. I just inhaled water, so excuse me, I might cough a little bit. But yeah, so, there's big arguments about that because a lot of people find meaning, deep meaning in going someplace that was special, like I said, like the Gulf of Mexico and spreading ashes there, but, things like that. But what is it? Again, it's not about what God can do, but our faithful response to God, and that there is a resurrection of the body. Is sort of the where we have to stick to, and that the body has eternal worth and value. So, other questions about that? Okay, so we're finally done after 17 million years. We're done with the introduction to theology section. So we'll go to this next one. I thought was the most helpful, useful one in both. It helps us learn about things, but also helps us understand why we do what we do. So this is what I would call the Eucharist explained. And so this is a section where we'll talk about all the different aspects, like why we do what we do and the theology behind why we do what we do. So hopefully this won't be as boring as the St. Athanasian Creed or something. So the first question is, why do we worship like we do? And we'll have people or visitors that may not be used to that. And they're like, what are y'all doing? Or why do we have communion every Sunday? Why does our worship look sort of otherworldly? And it comes from, in a lot of ways, the edict to do this in remembrance of me. So Christ told us at Last Supper, do this in remembrance of me. So, this is from the 2nd chapter of Acts, starting with verse 42. So those who received his word were baptized, and there were added that day about 3,000 souls. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. So early Christians, we see in the book of Acts, dedicate themselves to the breaking of bread. And so what is that when they say the breaking of bread? So everything okay?
I just need to open the office. There are way more kids down there than I thought there would be.
Okay, but then Elizabeth, here, do you need a key?
Yeah.
Oh, you got it? Okay, there you go. All right, and so we see, what does it mean, breaking of bread?
Communion,
Sir?
communion.
Right, or like, the most basic, at this point, the most basic thing you could say, they share sort of a sacred meal in some way, right? Where we learned at the Last Supper that Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke the bread, right? And so there's some ritual, mealtime ritual that goes with that, and that's, and Jesus also said, when you do this, or do this in remembrance of me. So we continue that on. So the church service, to some extent, or from one angle, viewed as a sacred meal that is shared because our Lord tells us to do this in remembrance of me. And so we see the church, the Acts of the Apostles, the early church doing that, dedicating themselves to the breaking of bread. So that vision, as I said there, helps shape our worship, also comes from Revelation chapters 4 and chapters 5. And so let me get that out of there and just read a little bit of that to you. Are there any questions while I'm looking this up?
Do we have any, as far as the earliest church, as far as what their communion looked like? I mean, exactly what they did as far as breaking.
Yeah, so there's a book, there's a primary source document or book, if you will, called the Didache. It was written in the 7th century. seventh decade, or the 70s, AD 70s. And it just sort of describes worship services a little bit. And so it was a sort of a formal, breaking of bread, sharing of communion, and this is my body, and it had some of the parts in there. So that's from the 70s, and that would be the first, sort of earliest non-biblical or non-Pauline or Johannine or apostolic writing that was on that subject.
What was the name of
The Didache. Don't ask me to spell that. It's Greek.
it?
Didache, right?
I'm sure. I
It
believe
seems familiar
the
from
Didache.
school, yeah.
Yes, so the Didache. And he's probably correct. I'm the worst speller. If anybody who ever reads church emails or church publishings knows that I spell maybe on second grade level or something. So we'll stick there. But in the book of Revelation 4 and 5 is when John is taken up into sees his vision of heaven. He's taken up and he sees a vision of worship. And so we pattern our worship after what John saw in a lot of ways. So chapter 4 begins like this. After this I looked, and lo, in heaven an open door, and the first voice which I heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, "Come up hither, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and lo, a throne stood in heaven with one seated on the throne, and he who sat there appeared like jasper. So I want y'all to kind of close your eyes and imagine the church building and church worship when I read this. And he who sat there appeared like jasper and cornelian, and round the throne was a rainbow that looked like an emerald. Round the throne there were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders clad in white garments with golden crowns upon their head. From the throne issued flashes of lightning and voices and peals of thunder, and before the throne burned 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there, as it were a sea of glass like crystal. And round the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures. And so I'll just read down to this part. So the first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with the face of a man, and the fourth living creature like a flying eagle. And the 4 creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes and round and within, and the day and night they never cease to sing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, and who was and is to come." And so it goes on through the conclusion of the 4th chapter into the 5th chapter, but it's sort of, could y'all sort of picture some aspects of our church or churches you've been in before, with the sort of throne and all the colors and the jewels and just the way things are set up in there. And so a lot of those visions from the book of Revelation also help shape the way we worship and the way our churches look and why we do what we do. And we'll get into that more. This is more just the introduction part. So, if you can imagine our own service with the bishop or the priest at the altar and everybody gathered around, the Gospels in chapter 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the lion, the man, the ox, and the eagle. That's where, if you wonder where the symbols of the evangelists come from, it comes from Revelation, and they attributed those to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Later on, Matthew wouldn't, or John wouldn't walk around like everybody, "Hey, the eagle, what's going on?" That sort of came after reflection on all this, and was attributed to them at a later date. So that's sort of what that is. So the earliest church services tried to have this in mind, or they had in mind the edict of our Lord, some of the words of Paul, some of the visions from the book of Revelation and things like that. So they tried to fulfill or live out that vision as best they could. So any questions about that first part? No? Okay. All right. So the Anglican Communion, we're a national, our church, we're like the Eastern Orthodox Church. Each country has a national church, and we're all, but the highest form of authority goes to a diocesan bishop. We in these United States have what's called a House of Bishops and a presiding bishop who oversees the other ones, the other bishops at those meetings, but we don't really have a primate, as it were, like other areas would have. In England, for instance, the Archbishop of Canterbury has a real authority over the other, and the other bishops and priests have a real obedience to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so you'll have, like Africa is an interesting place because on one side of Africa, on the eastern side of Africa, you had some very evangelical or low church people sort of, do that. And so the structure and hierarchy of the church is kind of like ours in America, where it's sort of democratic. There's not huge chains of authority and obedience. But then on the West Coast, like a place like Ghana and things like that, they're very sort of more Catholic minded, where they do have primates and archbishops and all, and the hierarchy kind of goes up the line where there's where they have more emphasis on that. But at the end of the day, every church is sort of a national church, and we're all together in a communion. Just like sort of like Eastern Orthodoxy, you have Greek Orthodox, Macedonian Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, and everybody kind of comes together. But it makes it very unruly. So that's a little bit. I don't know why I got off on that. I was talking about the Anglican Church. So that's a little bit about the Anglican Church, and so we try to live fully into that and remain entrenched in that very same vision. So our hope is that not too much has changed from the early church, or not the mechanics of what the early church saw. Or we still honor that in some way, right? We don't speak Greek or early church sort of languages, but and then in the modern world we have language has changed, and some of the things we do have changed, but for the most part we try to honor that vision. And so you'll see our churches. Our church here, St. John's, is consecrated and set apart solely for the purpose of Eucharistic worship. So we don't have, we do bend that a little bit to have like sacred concerts or things like that, but you wouldn't see like a band from downtown, come in and play in there. You won't see that space have multiple use. That space is only, it's reserved for public worship, and then also for private devotion. It's a sanctuary. It's a place where people can come and pray and all that, but it has one purpose, and it's set apart for that purpose. It's an offering to God and a house for our worship. So questions about that? So, again, like I said, that's stretched sometimes, like when you have like a piano concert or things like that, but for the overwhelming majority of time, it is not allowed to be used for anything but worship and or private devotion. Okay, so and then in the worship service, and you'll see this will become clear. So hang with me if this sounds like a bold, unbelievable claim, but the church teaches in some way that we're taken into heaven. So not like not in the most realistic or like the most scientific sense, we're not, right? So, but in the allegorical or spiritual sense, we believe we're taken into heaven, and we live into that vision of worship and revelation. So when we come together to celebrate the Holy Eucharist, we believe that we join in with the angels and the church triumphant that vision of revelation, and we join in with that, and live into that vision and join them in that vision. So there's a very mystical aspect to our worship and what we believe we're doing. So questions about that? Okay, so we believe in a lot of ways that heaven comes down and that Christ becomes present in the Word and the sacrament of the altar. So we believe that the veil or the space between heaven and earth is really very thin during our church worship. We're in a consecrated building, given over to that part. We've called on the Holy Spirit. We've called down, that and joined with the vision in Revelation, or joined with the people from the vision in Revelation. So we do believe that Jesus becomes present in both word and sacrament of the altar. And so you'll notice that steeples in church architecture sort of uphold, I said enforce in the notes, but uphold that theology, right? So when you look at a lot of at least Gothic cathedrals and churches through the day, they kind of reach up towards heaven, if you will. And you see the spire pointing towards heaven. Like the Methodist Church is the most prominent one in town here. You know, it's just a gorgeous, it's just like sticking out. But when you look in our church, you know, churches, I guess, traditional church, I don't know how to say that without, I'm not trying to be offended. You know, there's different ideas what church should function as in our county, but sort of the more traditional churches would try to would have architectural and other amendments and enhancements that would make you think you're in an otherworldly space. So like when you walk into our church, it's supposed to be unlike any other building that you go in. It's supposed to be very unique, or you're supposed to be identifiable. And why is it identifiable? Because of the sacred things and the symbols that point us heavenward, and the use of the space and the architecture that sort of, when we walk in, and you know, we feel like we're in a holy and set apart place. I think everybody, you know, it's kind of like, you know, McDonald's with the branding. There's like the double arches and all that, you know. So people are intentional about that. So the church is also intentional to try to help us move into that, or you know, that vision, for, like I said, from Revelation 4 and 5, and so it's sort of there. Now you'll have you know, different churches nowadays that you know, have sort of changed the way they understand themselves, and they would call the churches are more of an auditorium, and the church is a gathering of the people, not the building, and things like that. But and so that's a discussion for another day. But I'm just saying, you know, that sort of traditional church is what we're talking about there. So there we go. So much different look at worship. So it's not just going and sort of receiving encouraging words or saying, you know, we believe that we participate, glimpse heaven in our worship. Something that is not of this world happens when we all come together and go through the rituals and the prayers and the motions and the movements of liturgy. We believe that we participate in, you know, the heavenly choirs and in the movements and mechanics of the kingdom of heaven. And then we get to glimpse heaven also in our worship. So does that, and I'll explain this as we go through the different moving parts, but questions about that? No? So, Papa, how am I doing time?
We've got 8 minutes.
Okay. So, you know, so there was a big, you know, during the English Reformation and things like that. Have I told you where the hocus pocus? Have I told you about the hocus pocus? So, you know, those kind of things, because, like I said, there are a lot of abuses and there's so much going on around the English Reformation, but that's where, you know, a big change took place at the English Reformation, where, you know, like we're in Latin, like when the priest takes the Eucharistic bread and says, "This is my body." In Latin, it's "Hac est corpus meum," or, and if you say that really fast, hocus pocus, like is where like the Bugs Bunny comes from. Well, but it's a very important thing where they were saying that, you know, there were people and movements that were saying what was being done in the church is idolatrous. It's in some ways blasphemous. It's you know, it's in a lot of ways untrue and a lie, right? And so there were movements that would say that, you know, that Christianity is reasonable. We have to stay away from superstition and idolatry and those kind of things. And so that's where, like, sort of the Anabaptist you know, movement comes from. That you know, that says you don't need the priests, one, and then two, you have, you know, access to the Bible, but also that it's reasonable. Like faith is a reasonable matter, not a mystical matter. And so at the very beginning of that, you would see, you know, different people in power in England would kill the other people that weren't in power. So you had like the Puritans killing the Catholics, and you had the Catholics back in power killing the Puritans, and then, you know, just kind of went on. And there was, and again, we'll get this in church history, but then it kind of settled down. And now in our own day, you would see like churches like ours and the Catholic Church doing things that were unheard of around the time of the English Reformation, because they've been informed by, you know, sort of Anabaptist churches that you know, they're really good at certain things, and so they took some of those characteristics from them. And then also you'll see like the celebration of holidays like Christmas and Easter. Even when I was a little kid, was not, you know, there were a lot of churches around me, evangelical or Reformed churches, that would not celebrate Christmas or Easter. And even before that, it was outlawed. Like, you know, like it was seen, Christmas and Easter were seen as idolatry. are like sort of made up things, and so you'd have a lot of churches that would have prohibitions against the celebration of those. And nowadays you sort of, you see sort of a movement from that really far, evangelical, reasonable faith, back to the middle, and you see some of the stuff from the, the Orthodox Catholic or the sacramental side sort of moving to the middle, and so now you have most every church in Jones County, has Christmas Eve services or Easter services. There's a very few way out in the county that would still say this is, Christmas is idolatrous or Easter is idolatrous, things like that. But for the most part, that was started with, the wars and killings and murders and hostile takeovers is now sort of, things are sort of coming, everybody's kind of coming back to a middle sort of ground in America, which does my heart good, to see that everybody's, going to church at different times, and there's an interest in what the ancient church did, and an interest in liturgy and liturgical practice in a lot of ways, and so that's not a bad thing. So questions about that? I talked a lot. No questions? Okay. So there are several names you will hear for what we do here on Sunday morning. The one is the Lord's Supper. Now that comes straight from Scripture, right? So we celebrate the Lord's Supper. And you'll hear a lot of churches, especially in the South, that's sort of a very common way to talk about what we do, the Lord's Supper. We're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper this Sunday. You'll hear Eucharist a good deal, and that's a Greek word with the earliest official language of the church, and it's a biblical word, and it means thanksgiving at its heart. So Eucharist means to give thanks to God, and God gives thanks, and so there's a service of thanksgiving around that word. And so then you also hear another word, liturgy, which is from the Greek word liturgia, which means work or divine work, in this way, public work. We're participating in God's public work of sacrifice. And then you'll have probably the most controversial or misunderstood word for what we do in the service, Mass, right? Because you're in, like, I remember Ozzy Osbourne had the song, the generals lined up in their mass, just like witches at black masses, and everybody's like, this stuff like Mass was like some kind of evil, weird, malintent thing that people thought. But really, the last words in the service, the Lord be with you and also with you. Let us bless the Lord. Thanks be to God, or go as you are sent is what they would say. And in Latin, that's ite missa est. Go as you are sent. And so, in a lot of ways, in the old days, you would just shorten something to the one word. So ite missa est, go as you are sent. This means they're just saying Mass. It's the last word you said. So, are you going to Mass today? It comes from ite missa est, not from some kind of weird, pagan rituals or things like that, or wasn't incorporated. It's just sort of like we would say the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father. That's most known throughout the world as the Our Father. Say 3 Our Fathers, things like that. So that's what it is. The Mass just means go as you are sent. Ite missa est. And so that's just shortened for that. So how are we doing on time, Miss Pai?
4 minutes, 3, well, yeah.
3 minutes. Okay, so next week we'll start on the interest rite, but I've broken the parts of the service down into 5. You have the interest rite, or like coming into the church and preparing ourselves for worship. Then we have the liturgy of the Word, where God speaks to us through the Bible and through the reading of the Word. Then we have the liturgy of the sacrament, when we come to the altar and receive, prepare the altar and say all the prayers and recall our salvation history in that. And then communion is when we take communion and commune with God, and then exit rite is how we get out of there. So those are sort of 5 parts of the service that we'll be looking at. So finally, I guess that's a good place to start for next Sunday. But any questions about anything? So we got, are we 2 minutes left? 1 minute left.
You did great.
Is there any questions about anything? So again, I just want to state that, like talking about history and looking at other churches and all that, I'm not trying not to pick on other churches, and I'm using broad generalization. So, you know, so just bear with me. So I'm also not trying to say our church is better than others. You know, we do it the best way or the best thing. I'm just sort of saying, like, you know, from the Protestant Reformation, you know, came different ideas about what church was, and that affects how, you know, churches look and people act in churches and how people respond to God or interact with Jesus. So that's all I'm meaning by that. And so I think hopefully it's okay to sort of talk about differences sometimes, just in helpful ways, I hope. So if there are no other questions, I'll end right there then. Okay, thank you everybody. Merci beaucoup.